Cold water does not feel like cold. It feels like 100 hands closing over your skull at once, squeezing the air out through your ears, dragging the warmth out of your teeth. It tastes like snowmelt and iron, and the last word you never got to say. She was under, and the river did not care that she had survived everything else. It rolled her like a stone, packed her lungs with ice, and somewhere far above the churn, a band of pale spring light bent and broke apart. Then, a hand the size of a bear trap closed around her wrist, and the world tore upward. A voice scraped down through the roar, low and flat and smelling, even there, of wet hide and pine pitch. "Don't fight me." And then there was air. Rewind. 3 weeks before the river took her, the woman who would owe a stranger her life and despise him for it was standing in the rutted main street of a rotting silver camp called Quartz Bend, counting the last of her money into the chapped palm of a tollman. Her name was Sarah Vane, and she was 22 years old, and the smell of the place reached her before anything else did. Tailings and lamp oil and the sweetish rot of meat hung too long in a tent that called itself a butcher's. Quartz Bend was less a town than a wound somebody had cut into the flank of the Bitterroot Range and refused to let heal. False front saloons leaned over a street that was half mud and half crushed rock, a mercantile, an assay office with a cracked window, and at the edge of it all, where the road climbed toward the high passes, a man named Hollis Crane sat in a toll house he had built himself out of green lumber and other men's desperation, and took coin from everyone who wanted to cross the Quartz Bend Bridge to the diggings beyond. Sarah did not want the diggings. She wanted the homestead her late husband's brother had promised was waiting 2 valleys north, a quarter section with a sound cabin he had written, and a creek that ran clear. She had a town trade and no use for it out here. Back in Ohio, she had kept books for a milliner, copied invoices in a clean, small hand, balanced columns until the numbers sang. Her fingers knew ink, not axe handles. But Daniel was 3 months in the ground from a fever that took him in a week. The milliner had let her go the day after the funeral because a widow at the ledger made the customers uneasy, and the only thing left in the world that was hers was a single carved wooden token her mother had whittled, and her mother's wedding ring on a string around her neck. The token was the size of a thumbnail, a clumsy little bird with one wing longer than the other. Her mother had made it for her 7th birthday and told her it would always know the way home. The ring was thin gold, worn nearly to a wire. Together they were everything she had left to prove she had ever belonged to anyone. "Toll's $1, Hollis Crane said, not looking up from the ledger he kept the way a man keeps a dog he beats. He was perhaps 45, soft in the belly and hard in the eye, with a waxed mustache and a black coat going green at the seams. $1 to cross. Another $1 if the bridge is running high, on account of the danger." He said danger the way other men said weather, as if it were a thing that happened to other people, and earned him money either way. Sarah counted the coins. She had $11 to her name and 2 valleys to cross. "The bridge looks sound to me," she said. It was not. She did not know that yet. From where she stood, the Quartz Bend Bridge looked like any mountain crossing, a span of logs lashed and pinned over a gorge, where the river ran flat and brown and ordinary, 40 feet below. What she could not see, because Hollis Crane had been careful that no one should, was that the bridge had been built 2 summers ago of unseasoned timber by men he had underpaid, and that the spring before, 2 of the main stringers had cracked clean through in the thaw, and he had splinted them with iron straps and a coat of pitch, the same dull color as the wood, and collected his $1 and his extra $1 all season long. A surveyor had ridden through in March and told him to his face the span would not survive the high water. Hollis Crane had bought the surveyor a whiskey and watched him ride out of the territory and told no one. The river was just beginning to wake. Up in the peaks in the country where a different kind of man kept to himself, the snowpack had begun to soften under a sun that climbed a little higher each day. The water that would kill her was, right then, still frozen. A witness watched the toll, not a person. A goat, a scrawny, yellow-eyed pack goat tethered to the toll house rail, half-starved, its ribs a washboard under matted hair. It belonged to no one in particular. Crane used it to haul and let it forage what it could. When Sarah counted her $2 into the tollman's hand, the goat stopped chewing and turned its strange rectangular pupils on Crane, and did not look away, and then it backed to the very end of its tether, as far from the bridgehead as the rope would let it go, and planted its feet, and would not be dragged toward the span, though Crane swore and hauled. "Stupid animal," he muttered. "Won't set a hoof on the thing some days." Sarah filed it away the way she filed away a column that wouldn't balance, a small wrong number she had no time to chase. She shouldered her carpet bag, touched the wooden bird in her pocket the way some women touch a cross, and started across the bridge that a corner-cutting man's greed had turned into a trap, toward a future she was certain she had already paid for, in full. She was halfway across when the river answered. It did not build. That is the thing no one who has not seen a snowmelt flood understands, that it does not rise like a tide, slow and sorry. It comes down the gorge in a single brown wall, a season's worth of frozen mountain let loose in an afternoon by a warm wind 100 miles away, and it hit the underpinnings of Hollis Crane's bridge with the sound of a barn falling. Sarah felt the deck buck under her boots. She heard a crack like a rifle, then a second, then a long groan as the splinted stringers Crane had hidden under pitch gave up at last. The bridge did not collapse so much as twist, throwing her sideways against the rope rail. And then the rope rail was gone too, and there was a moment, she would remember it for the rest of her life, a single suspended moment when she hung in the bright spring air, with the broken bridge above her and the brown roar below, holding nothing, owing the world everything. And then the river took her the way it had been promised her all along. After that, there was only the cold and the dark and the hands of the water and the long, slow understanding that she was going to drown 2 valleys short of home with a wooden bird in her pocket and no one to know. The current rolled her into a sweeper, a fallen spruce combing the flood, and pinned her there, and the river piled onto her back and pressed her face toward the gravel. Her lungs were a fist. Bright spots bloomed behind her eyes. And then, from somewhere on the bank, through 40 feet of moving water and her own dying, came the impossible, a man going into the river after her on purpose. Elias Ward had not meant to be near Quartz Bend that day. He came down out of the high country twice a year and no more, to trade pelts for powder and salt and coffee at the mercantile, and the rest of the time the only voices he heard were his own, and the wind's. He was 38 and looked older, built long and heavy through the shoulders like something carved out of the same trees he lived among, with a black beard going gray at the jaw and hair he cut himself with a knife. A burn scar pulled the skin tight along the left side of his neck and down under his collar, an old smooth shine the color of tallow. He had got it at Shiloh, 26 years gone, pulling a man out of a powder wagon that went up, and the man had died anyway. Another scar cut through his right eyebrow, white in the black hair, from a trap that had kicked. He smelled of wet hide and pine pitch and wood smoke, and people in Quartz Bend stepped out of his way without quite knowing why. He had come to the bridge that morning only because the mercantile was on the far side, and he had been standing at the bridgehead with his pack when the river came down and the span twisted and the woman fell. And he did not think. That was the thing his body had learned in the war, and never unlearned. That thinking was the enemy of the next 10 seconds. He shed his pack and his heavy coat in 2 motions, saw where the current would carry her, ran 40 yards downstream along the bank to where the sweeper combed the flood, and went in. The cold hit him like a fist to the chest, and he ignored it. He got an arm around the spruce, got his other hand into the brown churn where he had seen her vanish, and felt cloth, and then a wrist, thin as a green branch, and he closed on it and hauled with everything 26 years of solitude had built into his back. "Don't fight me," he said, though she could not have heard, and he tore her up out of the water and over the trunk and onto the gravel bar, and she was gray and not breathing. He had pulled drowned men from the Tennessee River in the war. He knew the work. He turned her on her side and drove the heel of his hand into her back, hard enough to bruise, and the river came out of her in a brown gout, and again, and on the 3rd blow she convulsed and choked and dragged in a breath that sounded like cloth tearing, and then she was breathing, ragged, drowning still on dry land, but breathing. Her eyes came open. They found his face, the beard, the burn scar shining at his throat, the flat gray eyes looking down at her with the cold mechanical focus of a man assessing whether a tool was broken. And the first thing Sarah Vane felt, before gratitude, before anything a softer story would have given her, was a hot black flood of shame and fury that she was alive at all, and that this stranger had been the one to do it. She had wanted to owe the world nothing. She had counted her last dollars into a tollman's hand, precisely so that she would owe no one. And now she owed a debt that no ledger she had ever kept could balance. A life. She turned her face away from him and was sick into the gravel, and wept, and hated him for the air in her lungs. He did not comfort her. He took off his shirt, dry under the coat he'd shed, and wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. And then he sat back on his heels 3 feet away, close enough to catch her if she pitched over, far enough that she did not have to feel his hands again. The wind off the water was cutting. Upstream on the bridgehead, Hollis Crane had come out of his toll house and was standing very still, looking down at the wreck of his bridge and the 2 figures on the gravel bar far below. And the look on his face was not relief. It was calculation. A woman had gone into his river off his bridge in front of however many witnesses and survived, and the surveyor's words came back to him, would not survive the high water. And he understood, the way men like him always understand, that the dead tell no tales but the living do. He did not start down the bank to help. He went back inside and took out a different ledger, the one with no entries in it, and began to think about how a thing like this got buried. "Can you stand?" Elias said. It was not a question the way he said it. It was a fact he was waiting on. "I don't need," Sarah started and got her feet under her, and the gravel bar tilted and she went down hard on one knee. He did not reach for her. He waited. She got up again on her own, swaying, the river still pouring out of her in coughs, and she looked at him with her chin up and her teeth chattering and said, "I can't pay you." Something moved at the back of his eyes that was almost, not quite, the ghost of being amused. "Didn't ask you to," he said. He stood unfolding to his full height, and the woman who would spend a season learning the shape of him saw for the first time how big he was, how he blocked the pale spring sun, and she braced for the price. A price always came. A man did not haul a woman out of a flood for nothing. She had learned that the world ran on debt the way that river ran on snow. But he only picked up his pack and his coat, and shrugged into the coat and said, Camp's an hour up. You'll die of the cold down here. You can come or you can stay." And he turned and started up the bank without looking back to see whether she followed. Exactly the way a man walks who has decided that another person's choices are their own to make. She followed. Of course she followed. The alternative was the river. But she followed 3 steps behind, with her mother's wooden bird clenched in her fist inside his too big shirt, and her mother's ring a cold wire against her sternum, and she swore to herself with every aching step that whatever this scarred, silent giant wanted from her, she would find a way to pay it and be free, because owing was the one thing in the world Sarah Vane could not survive. The climb to Elias Ward's cabin taught her the first true thing about him. He did not slow down for her, but he never once got out of her sight. The trail switchbacked up through wet spring timber, ponderosa and larch just greening, the snow gone to rotten patches in the shadows, and the whole mountain running with melt, every gully a small, furious creek. Twice she fell. Twice she got up before he could turn around, though she knew somehow that he had heard her go down and had checked his stride and gone on only when her steps resumed. He carried her wet carpet bag without being asked and without comment, simply lifting it off the gravel where she dropped it and slinging it over his shoulder with his pack. By the time the trees opened onto a shelf of high meadow, backed by a granite cliff, the light was going gold and long, and her legs had stopped belonging to her. The cabin sat against the cliff the way a thing grows against a wall. 1 room, squat, built of fitted logs gone silver with weather, a stone chimney, a single shuttered window, a low door he had to duck through. A pole barn leaned beside it. A line of stretched pelts hung curing under the eave, beaver and marten and one great cinnamon bear hide, and the smell of them and of the wood smoke and the curing tallow was the smell that had come off him in the river, and she understood that she was walking into the inside of the man. He pushed the door open and stood aside. "Stove's there," he said. "Get warm. Don't touch the rifle." And that was the whole of his hospitality. Inside it was dim and close and astonishingly warm, where the banked stove still breathed. A rope bed with a straw tick and gray blankets, a plank table, 2 stumps for chairs, a shelf of tins. Traps hung on the wall in graded rows, iron and oiled, each in its place, and she understood from the order of them the same thing the goat had understood at the toll house, that this was a man who kept his dangerous things exactly where he could find them. He built up the fire without taking off his coat. He set a pot of water to heat. He took down a tin of something and a heel of dark bread and set them on the table near her, not handing them to her, just setting them where she could reach. And then he carried his bedroll out to the barn, and over his shoulder, flat as a man stating the weather, he said the thing that began to undo her. "I won't touch you. Door bars from the inside. Bar it if it makes you easier." And he went out and pulled the door to behind him and left her alone in the warm dark with food she had not paid for, and a bar she could throw against him if she chose. She did not eat at first. She sat on the edge of the strange bed, with the wet shirt steaming on her shoulders, and she waited for the catch, the price, the moment the door would open again on different terms. It did not come. She heard him moving in the barn, the soft sounds of a man bedding down among animals. She heard the goat. A goat lived here too, a milk nanny, and 3 chickens she'd glimpsed, and she would later learn he kept them not for company. He would have told you flatly, but because milk and eggs were logistics. After a long while, when the cold had got so far into her that her own pride could not hold it off, she ate. The bread was dense and good. The tin was stewed venison, rich with rendered fat. She drank the hot water he'd left, and she barred the door, not against him, she told herself, but because barring it was a thing she could do, a small coin of control in a day that had taken everything. And she lay down in a stranger's gray blankets that smelled of pine and wood smoke, and slept the deep, ugly sleep of the nearly drowned. And her last thought before the dark was that she still did not know his name. She learned it the next morning and not much else. He brought in goat's milk warm in a tin cup and set it on the table and said, "Drink that. You lost a lot of heat. Name's Elias if you need to call me something." She told him hers. He nodded once as though filing it where it belonged, and that was the extent of their first real conversation. The days that followed taught her the shape of his silence, which was not empty, but full, like the silence of deep timber. He rose before light. He ran a trap line that took him up the drainages for hours. She would watch him go, a dark, patient shape moving through the wet trees, and watch him come back at dusk with the day's catch frozen stiff over his shoulder. He skinned and fleshed and stretched by the barn in the long blue evenings, his hands sure and quick, and the cabin filled with the smell of green hides and the tallow he rendered in a great iron kettle. He spoke to her in instructions. "Don't drink from the low creek. Drink from the spring. Wood split small in the leferick that burns hot for cooking. If a bear comes in the yard, you get inside and you bar the door, and you do not come out for me. Never a word that could be mistaken for affection." And underneath every flat instruction, the same thing the surveyor had tried to tell Hollis Crane and been bought off from saying, "Here is how you stay alive." It made her furious. That was the part she could not have explained to anyone. His refusal to put a price on what he'd done, his refusal even to let her thank him, was itself a kind of debt that grew by the day, compounding like interest, and she had no way to discharge it. On the fourth morning, she could not stand it any longer. She got up before he did, and she built the fire, and she put on a pot, and when he came in from the barn, she said, hard, her chin up, "I'll earn my keep. I'm not a charity case. Tell me what work pays for a life, and I'll do it." She had meant it to sound strong. It came out close to begging. Elias looked at her for a long moment, and the burned scar at his throat caught the firelight. And what he said was so quiet, she almost missed it. "Stop trying to pay me back." He set down the brace of marten he was carrying. "You came into my river. I pulled you out. That's not a ledger. You start keeping accounts on a thing like that, it never balances, and you'll spend the rest of your life cold inside trying. I've seen it. So stop." It was the longest string of words she had heard from him, and the most furious she would ever see him. Which is to say, his voice dropped lower and his hands went still. "If you want to work because the work needs doing, then work. But not to pay me. That I won't take." It should have freed her. Instead, it broke something open. Because Sarah Vane had spent her whole life believing that love was a transaction and kindness was a loan, that her own worth was the sum of what she could provide. And here was a scarred, half-wild stranger telling her that the largest thing anyone had ever done for her could not be bought back, was simply hers, free, a thing she would have to learn to carry instead of repay. She turned away so he would not see her face. "Then I'll work because it needs doing," she said to the stove. And she did. What she could not do at first, she learned. Her milliner's hands, soft and quick with a pen, were useless and worse than useless that first week. She burned them on the kettle, cut the heel of her thumb to the bone learning the skinning knife, raised blisters that broke and bled on the maul handle. He did not coddle her and he did not mock her. When she cut herself, he washed it with spirit that made her hiss and bound it with a strip of clean flannel and said only, "Knife works toward the bone, not toward your hand. Turn the blade." When the maul bounced off the round and nearly took her shin, He set the round on a higher block and showed her once the swing that let the weight of the iron do the work instead of her shoulders, and then he went back to his own work and let her fail at it until she didn't. By the 8th day, she could split a rick of stovewood without weeping. By the 2nd week, her hands had begun to harden, the soft pads going to callous, and she caught herself one evening looking at her own cracked palms in the firelight with something she had no name for, a kind of fierce, ugly pride. And across the cabin she felt him notice, and neither of them said a word. On the 14th morning he handed her the skinning knife without a word, and stood back, and she understood it for what it was, a test he would not name and would not soften. She set the marten on the fleshing board, the way she had watched him do it 100 times, and she made the first cut wrong, too deep, and ruined a strip of belly fur that had been worth money. She waited for him to take the knife back. He did not. He said only, "Again," and turned a second carcass toward her, and let her ruin that one too, and a third less so. And by the 4th, her hands had found the angle that lifts the hide off the meat in one clean, peeling pull. And she looked up, and he was already gone back to his own work, which was the only praise he knew how to give, and the truest she had ever had. She learned the iron of the place that way, one ruined thing at a time. She learned that the cold came up through the floor before it came through the door, that a fire banked right at night would still hold a coal at dawn, that a marten rubbed against the willow was worth nothing, and a marten handled clean was worth a week of coffee and salt. She learned to set a trap so it would take an animal quick instead of slow, because he would not abide a slow death, even in the things he killed to live, and that told her more about the man than any confession could have. Her clean, small bookkeeper's hands cracked along the knuckles and bled and scabbed and hardened, and one evening she caught her own reflection in the dark window glass and did not know the woman looking back, and was not sorry. The mountain was the third thing in that one-room cabin, a weight that pressed on the walls after dark and had to be answered every single day in the same blunt coin, wood and water and meat and warmth. And somewhere in answering it beside him, she stopped counting what she owed and started counting what they had. Weeks bled into one another, measured by the shrinking stack of hides and the lengthening light. The mountain was the third character in that one-room cabin, a thing that pressed against the walls at night and had to be answered every day in the same blunt currency: wood, water, meat, warmth. She learned its economy. She learned that a marten pelt rubbed was worth nothing and a marten pelt handled right was worth a week of coffee. That the cold came up through the floor before it came through the door. That a person could be exhausted past speech and still get up because the fire would not build itself. She stopped flinching when he came in. He stopped carrying his rifle from room to room. And somewhere in the ordinary, brutal arithmetic of staying alive, two people who had each decided long ago that they would do their dying alone began, without once saying so, to do their living next to someone else. The goat was the thing that finally cracked the silence between them. The nanny took sick the 3rd week, off her feed, her milk gone bitter, and Sarah, who had grown up on no farm and knew nothing of animals, found herself awake in the night with the sick goats breathing rough in the lean-to and Elias's hands working over it by the light of a single tallow dip. He was steaming a poultice of crushed leaves, eucalyptus, he said, traded up from a packer who'd had it from a ship's stores, and yarrow he'd dried himself, and he had the goat's head in the crook of his arm and was coaxing the steam into it the way a man might gentle a child, all his terrible competence turned soft. Sarah knelt across from him in the lamplight and without being asked began to do what he showed her, holding the cloth, warming the next batch of leaves, and for an hour in the dark they worked over the animal together, hands almost touching, saying nothing, and the wary mistrust that had stood between them since the river thinned to something else. When the goat's breathing eased toward dawn, Elias sat back against the lean-to wall and let out a long breath and said, to the dark, not to her, "Had a wife once, long time back, before the war." Sarah went very still, the way she had learned to go still around the wild things he kept, so as not to spook the moment. Fever took her and the baby both, the winter of '61, while I was off learning how to kill men. He turned the tallow dip in his fingers, buried them in frozen ground with my own hands, and went back to the army because the army was easier than the quiet. The worst part of living up here, and here his flat voice caught just once on a stone in the stream of it, is that when you finally scream, the only thing that hears you is the trees. He looked at her then, full on, the firelight and the burn scar. I don't keep you here to pay a debt. I don't keep you here at all. You're free to go the day the pass is open. I'm telling you so you know I mean it. And then he got up and went out to check the line and left her kneeling by a sleeping goat with her mother's wooden bird in her hand, understanding for the first time that the silence she had taken for coldness was the sound of a man who had screamed into the trees for 26 years and learned that no one was coming. After that, the season changed between them, even as the snow went off the high country, and the meadow came green and starred with glacier lily and shooting star. They were not lovers. He never reached for her, and she had stopped waiting for the price that wasn't coming. But they became something the language of Quartz Bend had no word for. She learned the trap line. He let her run the near sets alone. She found she had a head for it. The same head that had once balanced a milliner's books, now reading sign and weather, and the small economies of fur. She kept a tally of the catch in a clean small hand on the back of a flour sack, and he watched her do it and almost smiled. He came in one evening with a marten she had taken in her own set, prime and dark, and he held it up and said, "That's a better pelt than 3 of mine this week. You've got the hands for it." And the earned validation in it, from a man who did not give words away, landed in her harder than any embrace would have. She turned the wooden bird over in her pocket and thought, maybe it does know the way home. Maybe home isn't a place after all. She did not say it. They did not say things like that. But she took the little wooden bird out of her pocket that night and set it on the windowsill where the last light could find it. The clumsy thing with one wing longer than the other, and she let him see her do it, and he looked at it a long moment across the cabin and did not ask, and she did not explain. And the not asking and the not explaining were a whole conversation between two people who had spent their lives keeping accounts and were learning, slow as the thaw, how to stop. But that night, when he carried his bedroll toward the barn out of habit, she said, "Stove'll go cold out there. Sleep inside. I'll bar nothing." And after a long moment, he set the bedroll down on the far side of the room, near the door, and lay down in his own cabin for the first time in a season. And across the banked fire, two broken people who refused to quit listened to each other breathe and did not pretend it was nothing. There came a night that tested the both of them before the men ever did. A late storm rolled up the drainage out of season wet and heavy and dropped a foot of spring snow on the meadow in the dark, and the weight of it cracked a limb off the big larch that came down on the pole barn and stove in a corner of the roof over the animals. They worked it together by lantern in the driving wet. No words, her holding the lantern and the lifting pole, while he set his shoulder under the broken purlin and took the whole sagging weight of it on his back so she could drive the brace home. His arms shook. She had never seen them shake. "Now," he said through his teeth, and she drove the wedge, and the roof held, and the goat and the chickens lived. And afterward they stood in the ruined doorway, soaked to the skin and steaming, breathing hard, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him through the cold, and neither of them moved away. You held it, she said, of the roof, of the weight, of more than that. We held it, he said, which was the closest he had ever come to saying the thing, and they went back inside and built the fire up high, and did not bar the door against each other or anything else. She should have known the river was not done with her. Men like Hollis Crane do not let the living walk around carrying the truth. While Sarah Vane was learning to skin marten and Elias Ward was learning to sleep with another heartbeat in the room, Crane had spent the thaw the way a careful man spends a season, quietly and with money. He could not let it be known that his bridge had been condemned and that he'd run it anyway, and that a woman had nearly died for his dollar. So he did what his kind always do. He hid behind paper. He filed with a territorial magistrate who owed him favors, a claim that the woman, Sarah Vane, had crossed his bridge against his posted warning, had damaged his property in the falling, and owed him for the span. And when that gained no traction because there was no woman to be found, and a dead woman pays no debts, he simply waited to learn whether she was dead. And in late spring, a packer carrying eucalyptus and tin up the high trails mentioned, over whiskey in Crane's own toll house, that the silent trapper Ward had a woman up at his cliff cabin now, a town woman, dark-haired, who'd come to him half drowned in the thaw. Crane went very still over his ledger, the way he had gone still on the bridgehead. The witness was alive. The witness was up a mountain with a man who could not be bought. And so Hollis Crane stopped thinking about money and started thinking about silence, and he rode down to the lower camp and found 4 men who would do a thing for pay and not ask why, and a corrupt deputy marshal named Pruitt who would make the thing look lawful afterward. And he told them there was a woman up at Ward's place who had stolen from him and run, and that the law wanted her brought down, and Ward with her if he made trouble. He did not tell them about the bridge. Men like Crane never tell you the real ledger. They just collect. The morning they came, Sarah smelled them before she saw them, and that was Elias's teaching in her now. Smell before sight. The way he'd taught her to read a yard. Horses. Strange horses, 5 or 6, sweating up the switchbacks, and under it the cold, oily smell of gun work. Elias was 2 drainages out on the line. She was alone at the cabin with the chickens and the mending goat, and her mother's ring at her throat. She did not panic. That surprised her later when she had time to be surprised by anything. That the woman who had wept on the gravel bar at owing her life now stood in the cabin door and counted the riders coming up the trail the way she'd once counted coins into a tollman's hand, cold and exact. 6, 5 hard men with rifles across their saddle bows and 1 in a deputy's tin star, and riding a little apart, soft in the belly and hard in the eye, in a black coat gone green at the seams, the tollman himself. "Sarah Vane," the deputy called up, reining in at the edge of the yard. "You're wanted in Quartz Bend on a complaint of theft and damage. Come down peaceable and it goes easy." Behind him, the 4 hired guns spread out across the meadow with the loose competence of men who had done this before. And Hollis Crane sat his horse at the back and looked at her with the calculation she had seen on the bridgehead, and she understood the whole shape of it at once. The way a ledger comes clear when you find the one false entry. That this was not about theft, had never been about theft. That she was the false entry in Hollis Crane's books, and he had come up the mountain to erase her. She did the thing Elias had taught her. "There's a bear been in the yard," she called down, steady, buying the one thing that mattered, which was time and noise. "Let me get inside before it comes back." And she stepped back through the door and barred it, and took down the rifle he had told her never to touch. The lever-action Winchester oiled and waiting in its place on the wall, and she remembered him showing her once, flatly, because a person alone in this country should know how it loaded and how it threw and how you did not jerk it but squeezed. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that distantly with a kind of wonder. The hands that had trembled over a tollman's coins, that had wept at a debt, they were steady now, steady as his, because somewhere in a season of cracked palms and a goat mended in the dark, and a man who would not let her pay him back, Sarah Vane had stopped being a thing the world transacted and become a person the world would have to reckon with. She broke out the cabin's one shuttered window an inch and laid the barrel in the gap and waited and prayed to a mother's wooden bird that the man who'd pulled her from the river would hear the trees scream this once and come. He heard the shot, not the first shot. There was no first shot from her, not yet. She held her fire with a discipline that would have frightened them if they'd known a town bookkeeper had it in her. The shot Elias heard was Pruitt the deputy putting a round through the cabin door to frighten her out, and it carried down the drainages flat and wrong, a gun sound where no gun should be. And 2 miles out on his trapline, Elias Ward dropped a half-skinned marten in the snow rot and was running before the echo died. He came back the way the river had come down the gorge, all at once, without warning, a season of cold patience let loose. He didn't come up the trail where they'd see him. He came down the cliff at the back of his own cabin, the granite face he knew like the lines of his own hands. And he came out of the timber behind the hired guns with the cold mechanical focus that had pulled drowned men from a war. And the meadow that had been 6 armed men against 1 barred door became, in the space of a held breath, something else. She saw it from the window the way you see lightning, in pieces that do not connect until later, the dark shape coming out of the timber where no shape should be, the first hired man folding before the sound of it reached her, the others turning too slow, always too slow, against a thing that had spent 26 years learning how not to be slow. And she understood watching that her part was not to wait to be saved. He had not come to save her. He had come to stand beside her, and standing beside someone meant you carried your end of the weight, the way she had carried it under the barn roof in the snow, and so she did not cower behind the bar. She worked the lever the way he had shown her, and she kept the window, and she made the yard a place where no man could cross to the cabin door and live easy. And between the two of them, the giant in the open and the bookkeeper at the glass, the 6 became 5, and the 5 became a scatter of running men. What happened in the yard happened fast, the way the truly violent things do, and afterwards Sarah could never lay the pieces of it down in order. She remembered the window. She remembered Crane shouting at the hired men to burn her out, to fire the cabin and end it, and one of them swinging down with a brand from his own saddle, and her own voice gone, and her finger taking up the slack on the Winchester the way Elias had shown her. Squeeze. Don't jerk. And the man with the brand spinning away from the door with the torch flung wide, and the brand guttering harmless in the wet meadow grass, and the 4 hired guns suddenly understanding that the woman behind the door was not freight, was not the easy thing they'd been paid for. And then Elias was among them. He took the first man down before any of them knew he was there, with the flat of an axe and no wasted motion. The second turned, and Elias was already inside his rifle, too close to shoot, and put him down too. The hired men had been paid to terrorize a woman. They had not been paid for this, for a thing that came out of the timber, smelling of pine and silence, and did not seem to feel the one round that one of them got off wild, and their courage, which had only ever been the courage of numbers and an easy target, broke. two of them went for their horses. Pruitt, the deputy, raised his pistol toward the cabin window, and Sarah, steady, squeezed, and his arm jerked down and his pistol went into the grass and he was running for his horse with his star and his lawful complaint forgotten, the way Crane's kind always run the instant the price of the thing exceeds the pay. And then it was only Hollis Crane, alone in the middle of the meadow on a horse that danced under him, soft in the belly and white in the face, with his hired men fled and his deputy bleeding, and the truth standing there in the open at last. Elias came across the grass toward him with the axe low and the burn scar livid at his throat, and a stillness on him worse than any shouting, and Crane did the only thing his kind ever does. He pleaded the paper. "There's a complaint," he said, his voice gone high. "It's lawful. She owes me. The bridge. She damaged the—" And here Sarah Vane came out of the cabin door with the Winchester still in her hands, level, steady. And she finished his sentence for him in a voice he had heard once before, counting coins. "The bridge," she said, "that you built out of rotten timber and splinted with iron and pitched over so it'd look sound. The bridge a surveyor told you in March would not hold the high water." She walked toward him and he backed his horse and could not back it far enough. "You took my $2. The extra one was for the danger. You knew. You've known for 2 years. And when the river finally did what you knew it would do, and I didn't have the decency to drown, you came up here to finish it." Her hands were not shaking. "I kept books, Mr. Crane, for 9 years. I know exactly what it looks like when a man cooks a ledger to hide what he's done. And I am the witness." She did not raise the rifle to him. She did not have to. The raising of it would have made her his kind, a person who settles a thing with a price in blood. Instead, she lowered it, deliberately, and let him see that she did not need it, that the worst thing she could do to Hollis Crane was not kill him, but let him live in a world that now knew. "Ride down," she said. "Ride down to Quartz Bend, and the assay office, and the magistrate, and you tell them what you did, before I do, because I am coming down behind you and I will be telling everyone I meet, and there is not enough money in your green seam coat to buy back the truth once it's loose." Hollis Crane looked from the woman with the steady rifle to the scarred man with the axe, to the empty meadow where his hired courage had fled, and the calculation went out of his eyes and left only the thing that had always been under it, which was fear. And he wheeled his horse and went down the mountain at a run, and the deputy Pruitt went after him clutching his bloodied arm. And the thing that the river had started in the thaw ended in a green meadow with no one dead, which is the only kind of ending worth having. The truth went down the mountain ahead of them on the tongues of a packer, and an assayer and a magistrate who, it turned out, did not owe Hollis Crane quite enough to hang himself alongside him. The bridge was condemned and Crane's name with it, and a tollman who had cut a corner to save $1 lost everything he had built on other men's danger, which is a slower justice than a bullet, and a truer one. But that is not the part of the story that matters. The part that matters happened after, in the quiet, the way the things that matter always do. Elias came to her across the meadow, and for the first time since the river he reached for her, slow, giving her every chance to step back, and put his hand against the side of her face the way he had gentled the sick goat, and she did not step back. "Your hands weren't shaking," he said. It was the highest thing he knew how to say. "No," she said, "you taught me." And they stood like that in the green meadow with the glacier lily blowing around their boots and the cliff at their backs warm in the sun. And neither of them said the word that a softer story would have made them say, because they had earned a thing past words. He tried once to give her the road. That was the last test, and the truest, and the one that proved he had meant every flat thing he'd ever said to her. A week after the meadow, with the passes open and the high trails dry, he laid a small, heavy thing on the plank table where he'd once laid bread she would not eat. It was a leather pouch, and it clinked. "Pelts brought good money this season," he said, not looking at her, looking at the fire. "Your half's in there, and more. Enough to get to San Francisco and start clean. A woman with a head for figures in a city, you could keep books for a bank. Buy your own. You don't owe me a season of your life because I happen to be standing on a bank. The road's dry. You should take it." And he had said it so steadily with such cost that she understood he believed it was the right thing, the unselfish thing, to open his hand and let her go free of him the way he had refused to let her pay the debt, that he loved her in the only language he had, by trying to give her up. Sarah Vane picked up the pouch. It was heavy, heavier than the $11 she'd carried up the mountain, heavy as a future. And she carried it across the cabin to the hearthstone he'd shown her was loose, the one he kept a little powder under against the damp. And she lifted the stone, and she put the pouch beneath it, in the cold dark under the floor of the cabin. And she set the stone back down on top of a fortune, the way you bury a thing you have decided you do not need. Then she took her mother's ring off the string at her throat, the thin gold worn to a wire, the only thing besides the wooden bird that proved she had ever belonged to anyone, and she set it on the mantel where he would see it every day. Not on her hand, not a wedding, nothing the language of Quartz Bend had a word for, but a thing left in the open between two people who had stopped keeping accounts. "I kept books for 9 years," she said. "I know what's worth more than money." She put the carved wooden bird beside the ring, the clumsy little bird with one wing longer than the other that her mother had told her would always know the way home. "It found the way," she said. "I'm not running anymore. The pouch stays under the floor. I stay on the mountain. Not because I owe you, because I choose you. That's the only kind of staying that was ever worth a damn." And Elias Ward, who had buried a wife in frozen ground and screamed into the trees for 26 years and learned that no one was coming, looked at the ring on his mantle and the bird beside it, and the woman who had pulled herself up out of his river and out of a lifetime of believing she was something to be bought and sold. And he did the thing he had not done since before the war. He let himself be found. He crossed the room and he took her cracked, calloused, capable hands in his scarred ones, and he held them the way you hold the one thing the cold cannot have. And he said the only word that was ever big enough, which was her name. And outside the high cabin the spring went on into summer, and the goat mended, and the meadow burned green and gold, and two broken people who had refused to quit found in the harshest country either of them had ever known, the one thing that cannot be bought or owed or paid back, but only chosen, freely in the open, with a wooden bird to witness it. If the story of a woman who owed a stranger her life and learned that the only debt worth keeping is the one you choose to pay forever, move something in you tonight, then stay with me a while. Share this with someone who knows that the strongest people aren't the ones who never break. They're the ones who refuse to quit, who pull themselves up out of the cold water one more time, who learn that being saved isn't a debt and being loved isn't a price. Subscribe and keep the notifications on so the lamp's always lit for you up here at Timberline Hearts, because the cold is cruel but the bond is unbreakable, and there's always another story waiting up the pass. And tell me down in the comments, because I want to know which one you are. When the riders came up the mountain and the cabin had a bar on the door and a rifle on the wall, would you have stayed inside behind the bar where it was safe? Or would you have taken down the Winchester and stood in the broken window and waited for them the way Sarah did? Stay inside or grab the rifle? let me know. And I'll see you up the pass next week.